All right. Hi, I'm Soma, and this is my presentation on the Nanotyrannus, and specifically the controversy within the scientific community surrounding the Nanotyrannus. Great. So before we start talking about this Nanotyrannus and what its implications are and how the understanding of Nanotyrannus has evolved over the years, I want to first remind ourselves uh, this idea that we covered in one of our lectures of holotype worship, and specifically the idea of splitting versus grouping. Just to remind everyone, grouping is an ideology concerning holotypes that uh, simil- fossilized specimens with similar characteristics should be uh, contained within one group, that they should be lumped together within a specific holotype because uh, you know it they are similar, therefore they fall within one holotype. And splitting is the reverse ideology, where we should look at fossilized specimens, look at differing characteristics, and separate them into more holotypes. Um, and the both sides of the debate have avid supporters and viable reasonings behind them. Um, and I'm bringing this up for a few reasons. First is it will help with sort of our understanding of the debate surrounding Nanotyrannus for a variety of reasons. Uh, and more generally, it's the to clarify, the idea of splitting specimens apart versus grouping specimens together is sort of an important part of this debate um, of Nanotyrannus. And another reason I bring this up is to bring up a more general point that whilst our understanding of science is that it is fact based and very rational, it's still hard to find for many topics within the scientific community. It's hard to find consensus. Um, you know, if you look at even when we talked about you know the the mass extinction, whether it was volcanoes or asteroids, it's sort of along the same lines where it's like we have a lot of evidence, but there are many ways to draw conclusions. So therefore, finding consensus is difficult. And the third reason is to sort of introduce my ideology, which sort of helps. At least it helps me, or helps you sort of uh, understand my viewpoint going into this assignment, this research. It it's you know it helps. My ideology is that splitting is more scientifically valid or viable. This is just my opinion, obviously, but my reasoning behind this is, first of all, fossilization is a rare occurrence, and it would be difficult, I think, to assume that you know all species, similar fossils are all the same species. First of all, because fossilization is rare, and the fact that biodiversity makes it so that there are a lot of species on the planet, and that's certainly true today. Although we there are a lot of endangered species, but I mean that's not the point. Um, and so it would have been true, in the Cretaceous, Jurassic, and Triassic periods during the Mesozoic era. So yeah, so you know, my understanding is because fossilization is rare and there was an abundance of species, that differences between fossilized specimens are more likely attributed to difference in species rather than unique characteristics within a species. That being said, with enough evidence, um, I think it is possible to group them together. My opinion concerning splitting is more concerned around newly discovered fossils that don't have a lot of research going into them. That the splitting mentality is sort of like a precaution, in case splitting, in case like it is a separate species, it's better to assume that they are different species and then using evidence lump them together. Whereas instead of assuming that they are all one species and then using evidence to split them apart. Again, this is just my opinion, but it sort of helps. It informed my understanding of the debate surrounding Nanotyrannus. So the Nanotyrannus, a picture. So sorry, the Nanotyrannus was based on this fossil CMNH 7541 that was discovered in 1942 by the David Dunkel, Dr. David Dunkel. And you see here that this is a replica, I believe, of the specimen that was found. The more accurate depiction is listed here. This is just, this is a digital reconstruction of the skull. And for a long time, almost 40 years, it was up for debate what the what species this fossil was from. Some people suggested it was, Charles W. Gilmore suggested that it was a Gorgosaurus. There was others. There was one study in 1970 that suggested it was Albertosaurus. And it was up for a debate for a really long time, you see here, until about 1988 when Bob Baker suggested that the skull was actually a completely different species that hadn't been discovered yet, called the Nanotyrannus. And they described the Nanotyrannus as a relative of the Tyrannosaurus, but was simply sort of smaller in scale. And indeed, the skull here depicted was smaller than most tyrannosaurs, and there were enough key differences between this skull, the CMNH 7541, and the T-Rex skull, including there was, for instance, there was the Nanotyrannus skull had much more teeth. There was an abundance of teeth, and there were more bone plates in the skull of the Tyrannosaur, of the Nanotyrannus. The Nanotyrannus had more bone plates in its skull, and that suggested, and based on this evidence, it was suggested that Nanotyrannus was a completely new species. Of course, consensus is hard, and so there were disputing studies. Most notably Carr et al., 1999, that suggested that Nanotyrannus was really just a juvenile T-Rex. However, at this time there wasn't a lot of evidence, suggesting the connection between the Nanotyrannus and the Tyrannosaur. There's this huge gap in size and the number of teeth and the bone plates, and so it really was a big debate in during this time. And this debate continued. And at this point, I'm just going to interject here. And, my scientific ideology concerning splitting versus grouping at this point would lean more towards Bob Baker's um, conclusion, because there are differences in the skull structure, the number of teeth, the size. I and there's since there's no explanation for how like the first skull, it assuming that it was a juvenile T Rex, there was no evidence saying that juvenile T Rex lost teeth and then fused their bone plates together uh, in that way. I would more, you know, likely, uh, associate my understanding of the CMNH 7541 fossil specimen as a separate species. And and had this been all the evidence presented, this wouldn't be much of a debate for me. However, in 2001, uh, there was a discovery of a fossil in Ekalaka, Montana, and they named this fossil Jane. Um, you know, and this was a very complete uh, fossil of a tyrannosaur. And on this alone, it would have been like it's a great specimen. It was, based on the skull, it was identified as a T Rex, and the great thing about Jane was that it was similar to the CMNH. Sorry, the body, the body shape, the the skeletal, uh, the skeleton was that of a Tyrannosaurus, and this fossil was great because it was similar to CMNH 7541, but it also explained some of the differences that if it filled in some of the gaps between and the juvenile and the mature T Rex, and it helps suggest the idea that Nanotyrannus might not actually be an entirely different species, but in fact it is simply a juvenile T Rex. And some of the evidence, um, sort of, the discovery of Jane helped this idea of Tyrannosaurus growth. In the left image, you see sort of the growth curve of Tyrannosaurus, and for a long time there was a big gap between the juveniles and the mature T Rexes, and there's not a lot of like adolescent age T Rexes. And Jane was the perfect intermediary between the two um, ideas, and it was similar to CMNH 7541, and so that suggested that Nanotyrannus was in fact an adolescent T Rex, and this idea of this adolescent, intermediary stage uh, development was further suggested uh, through fossil analysis. That's the image on the right. Um, there was a study that investigated. Uh, they took samples of the fossils tibia and femur and sort of looked for lags in the fossils, and what they found was that uh, you know Jane had 8 visible lags with room for two. No, sorry, 9 visible lags and room for 2 more lags, and so this suggested that Jane was about 11 years old, and so this further sort of uh, helped suggest that Jane was in fact an adolescent T-Rex, and that um, Nanotyrannus was a in fact an adolescent T-Rex. And at this point, um, I came to the conclusion that the Nanotyrannus is actually a juvenile T-Rex, based on this evidence. It's for me, it's a little difficult to concede this opinion because when I say difficult, I mean I don't mean like I don't want this to be a thing. I'm using difficult in terms of it's sort of against my ideology. Um, my first assumption would have been that Nanotyrannus was in fact a separate species, but because of the evidence that I've discovered through the research of this topic, I've come to the conclusion that Nanotyrannus is in fact, a juvenile T Rex based on the growth curve of the Tyrannosaurus and the fossil analysis. And it should be noted that Bob Baker still believes that Nanotyrannus to this day is a different specimen, and he says that um, if he found another fossil that would help further support his argument for the Nanotyrannus. However, it's currently privately owned, and he tried to auction it for several $1,000,000. So, um, for most paleontologists, investigating privately owned fossils is difficult. It's sort of against a lot of ethical considerations for many paleontologists because it's privately owned, and the risking damage is not it's not great. So there hasn't been a lot of research gone into the newly discovered Baker fossil, and so uh, until until investigation on this new fossil um, arises, I think it's safe to assume that Nanotyrannus is a juvenile T Rex. In the future, there may be more evidence suggesting otherwise. However, at this time, there's no the evidence I think points towards this juvenile T Rex idea. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. That is it. Yeah.